How low and how fast can Vtol aircraft be flown while following the contour of ridges, valleys, and mountains? Rolling hills, behind trees and other vegetation. Along flat terrain. How do weather conditions, such as visibility or air turbulence, affect flying this close to the Earth's surface? Can the pilot find his way to his destination? Can he endure the stresses, the anxieties inherent in this type of mission? How susceptible is the aircraft to ground observation? What special flying qualities should Vtol aircraft have to perform in a nap of the Earth regime?
In October 1967, Lockheed embarked on a flight test program to determine the minimum altitude and highest speed up to 225 knots at which Vtol aircraft could be operated in maintaining a nap-of-the-earth flight environment. Evaluation of pilot and aircraft with respect to maneuverability, controllability, pilot efficiency, navigation, mission effectiveness, and human factors were the prime considerations. The program was supplemented by the U.S. Army Combat Development Command Visual Identification Spotter Program. Their objective was to determine the capability of ground observers to detect Vtol aircraft flying in various altitude airspeed envelopes. U.S. Army ground observer teams, along with Lockheed observers and cameramen, recorded both oral and visual detection time of the aircraft as it approached and passed their ground positions. 4 Lockheed test pilots, each with varying degrees of experience in Vtol aircraft, were assigned to fly Lockheed's L-286 rigid rotor helicopter and the XH-51A compound research aircraft. The L-286 made data runs at constant speeds of 50, 75, 100, and 125 knots. Constant speed runs of 150, 175, 200, and 225 knots were flown in the XH-51A compound research aircraft. The compound aircraft is an XH-51A rigid rotor helicopter modified to incorporate a stub wing for lift augmentation and a jet engine for thrust augmentation. The combination of wing and auxiliary thrust are utilized to unload the rotor at intermediate and high airspeeds, thereby providing the capability of attaining higher airspeeds than can be attained by pure helicopters. Both test vehicles were instrumented to provide continuous measurement and recording of true airspeed, tape line altitude, longitudinal and lateral cyclic stick positions, pitch, roll, and yaw angles, and CG vertical accelerations. A cockpit camera obtained a photographic record of indicated airspeed, altitude, and free air temperature. Knowledge of these quantities enabled the calculation of true airspeed at each data point. A second camera, simulating the view of an observer sitting behind the pilot, also documented each data run. 3 flight corridors for the nap-of-the-earth missions were selected by Lockheed and the Army representatives in the area northeast of Lockheed Flight Test Facility at Oxnard, California. The flat terrain corridor was generally aligned along the Santa Clara River between the cities of Satakoy and Fillmore for a usable distance of 10 nautical miles. A flight corridor of 20 nautical miles was achieved by making a second run in the opposite direction. The terrain was comprised mainly of river bottom broken by trees and shrubbery. About 3 miles from the east end, the corridor was bracketed by these high-tension towers that supported power lines which crossed the flight path. A low highway bridge with parallel power lines crossed the river approximately 3 miles from the west end of the corridor. 24 data runs were made over the flat corridor, covering the entire speed envelope of 50 through 225 knots. Since the terrain was essentially flat, the maneuvering requirement was basically one of lifting over small obstacles. In general, the surface was always in view, providing the pilot with a good ground reference level. Results indicated that for an average pilot flying over flat terrain, the change in mean altitude was approximately 10 feet at 50 knots to 55 feet at 225 knots. The altitude standard deviation was nearly constant, having values of about plus or minus 9 feet at 50 knots and plus or minus 25 feet at 225 knots. The relative insensitivity of these deviations and mean altitude to increased airspeed is attributed to the flatness of the terrain. Aircraft attitudes, control motions, and load factors substantiate that only minimal maneuvers were required. In earlier high-speed tests, the ground observer base station was situated on the riverbed with 8 additional observer posts located to the north, utilizing the natural masking in the area. Heavy rains necessitated relocating the base station to a position north of the riverbed, but the other observer posts remained identical for all the runs. At all ground observer locations, the flight path was held to within 300 yards of the base station. No attempt was made to surprise the observers, and they were notified by radio on every flight that the test aircraft was approaching. A tape recorder was used to record these aircraft sounds and observer comments during the data runs.
Oh man, I thought it wasn't going fast enough to stay airborne.
These ground camera tracking shots were photographed at normal speed using a 25mm lens, which approximates normal eye vision relative to image size, speed, and proximity. As airspeed increased, average visual and oral observation time decreased. Even though the cameramen had considerable experience in tracking fast-flying aircraft, it was extremely difficult for them to keep the compound helicopter in sight as it passed their ground positions at the higher speeds.
Man, he really fooled us that time.
You fooled me, copy.
Man, oh man.
I tell him he got good.
I didn't even get a look at it.
The rolling terrain corridor was situated between South Mountain and the Camarillo Hills for a usable distance of approximately 20 nautical miles. The contours consisted of gentle to moderately sloping hills with good separation between the peaks. The ground was a mixture of grass, brush, and trees. Early in the program, a major brush fire blackened much of the area along the rolling corridor. This caused a depth perception problem in these areas because it was difficult to see ground contours against this dark background. Since this type of terrain did not provide the pilot with a continuous ground reference, sufficient altitude had to be maintained to provide clearance over obstacles possibly hidden beyond the hill or ridge. Both the mean value and standard deviation of altitude was higher than the data obtained from the flat course. Air turbulence varying from light to rough was encountered on every flight, and this resulted in generally higher altitudes than the pilots felt would be possible in smooth air. The mean altitude on this corridor was about 45 feet at 50 knots and increased to 140 feet at 225 knots. The altitude standard deviation increased from approximately plus or minus 20 feet at 50 knots to plus or minus 65 feet at 225 knots. The ability to maintain constant altitude and airspeed lessened under these terrain conditions due to the heavier workload required for terrain avoidance, as well as due to the direct load factor effects on performance. Navigational problems were encountered at the lower speeds. Pilots had to fly circuitous routes through the canyons in search for low points to clear rising terrain and obstructions. At the higher speeds with the compound helicopter, the pilots were able to fly a more direct route and navigational problems were not encountered. Cyclic and directional control were augmented by the J-60 auxiliary thrust, which was varied over its full range. In many instances, it was possible to get into the bottom of a canyon by using the idle thrust and then climbing out with maximum thrust. The pilots were able to select their flight paths primarily to take advantage of the cover and concealment afforded by the terrain and were not restricted by load factor limitations on performance. The locations of the ground observers on this test corridor were out in the open with no means of concealment.
Straight ahead about 11 o'clock now, going over the at eye level.
26 seconds, and he puts it back down.
And wait. Oh, we could have brought down the rocks.
Even with the advance notice of the approaching aircraft and the excellent visibility afforded the unconcealed ground observers, average visual and oral observation time still decreased significantly at the higher airspeeds of the compound helicopter. The rough terrain corridor started at the base of South Mountain at the Santa Clara River and traversed eastward along the ridges for a usable distance of 10 nautical miles. A return run over this corridor provided a total distance of 20 nautical miles. Many closely spaced, sharp mountain ridges intersected the flight path at various angles on this corridor. Also present were many cuts and canyons and occasional high-tension wires. This corridor, too, was burned extensively by the brush fire and created pilot depth perception problems. The largest variations in airspeed and altitude occurred when flying over this corridor. The ridges were often too close together to fly down into and out of the valleys. In the low-speed range, the non-compound helicopter did not have sufficient power response or zoom capability to conduct low-level operations safely in the turbulence occurring around the mountains. In those areas where the terrain was compatible with the speed flown, it was possible to fly in a nap-of-the-earth environment. In general, throughout most of the course, higher altitude margins were required to allow satisfactory clearance of closely spaced terrain features and obstructions when maneuvering. The mean altitude on this corridor varied from approximately 55 feet at 50 knots to 210 feet at 225 knots. The altitude standard deviation increased from approximately plus or minus 25 feet at 50 knots to plus or minus 85 feet at 225 knots. The airspeed standard deviation was the highest on this corridor and decreased with increasing airspeed. Here, as with the rolling terrain corridor, the J-60 thrust on the compound helicopter was varied over its full range to good advantage. It was possible to get into the bottom of a canyon by using the idle thrust and then climbing out with maximum thrust, thus affording the compound helicopter with an excellent terrain following capability. Navigational problems at the lower speeds were intensified on this corridor. The lack of auxiliary thrust in the L-286 helicopter made it more difficult to negotiate the extreme changes in elevation, and pilots were obliged to fly extremely devious routes, which added many miles and flight time to these data runs. As experienced over the rolling terrain corridor, at the higher speeds with the compound helicopter, the pilots were able to fly a more direct route and navigational problems were not encountered. On the rough terrain corridor, the observer site was relatively free of foliage. Some visual masking was accomplished with the surrounding hills, but in general, the positions were out in the open and offered no concealment for the observers. Consistent with results from the flat and rolling corridors, ground observers recorded a continuing decrease in visual and oral observation time as airspeed increased to 225 knots. The objective of determining the minimum altitude and highest speed up to 225 knots true airspeed at which Vtol aircraft can be operated while maintaining a nap-of-the-earth flight regime was successfully met, and the following significant results were obtained. 1. Nap-of-the-earth flight is possible in the L-286 helicopter at airspeeds between 50 and 125 knots. And in the XH-51A compound helicopter at airspeeds between 150 and 225 knots. 2. Aircraft maneuverability and controllability are acceptable at all test conditions. 3. For a given terrain type, mean altitude increases with increasing airspeeds. The altitude variation as a function of airspeed for the two aircraft over flat, rolling, and rough terrain is presented here. The increase in mean altitude with airspeed is substantiated by the fact that the pilot has to fly at a higher altitude to obtain terrain clearance, since the radius required to perform a pull-up or turn varies directly with the square of airspeed at a given load factor. 4. Mean altitude also increases as the ground contour progresses from flat to rough, and this reflects the added altitude margin needed to obtain satisfactory terrain clearance. However, it should be noted that the increased roughness of the terrain affords greater concealment from ground observation. More maneuvering is also required to follow the ground contour as the terrain becomes more severe, with an attendant increase in both the frequency of application and magnitude of load factor. The ability to maintain a constant altitude is lessened because of the increased workload required to keep clear of obstructions, as well as due to direct load factor effects on performance. However, airspeed control is more positive in the compound because forward thrust is independent of the rotor. Both the wing and rotor provide lift, whereas forward thrust is provided independently by the auxiliary jet engine. 5. For a given terrain type, time seen decreases with increasing airspeed. Variation in the average time seen for the two aircraft over flat, rolling, and rough terrain is presented here. As airspeed is increased from 50 to 225 knots, time seen decreases 65% for flat terrain and 63% for rolling and 70% for rough terrain. Note also the dramatic step decrease in time seen for the compound aircraft over rolling and rough terrain. In addition to increased speed, two factors appear to be responsible for this decrease in time seen. First, the compound's large margin of independent forward thrust, and thus climb-out capability. And second, the high maneuvering load factor available from the combination of wing and rotor, in which the wing supplements rotor lift during high G maneuvers. Over rolling and rough terrain, the compound pilot then has sufficient power reserve and load factor available to maintain close terrain following without sacrificing airspeed. It should be noted that a reverse thrust provision for braking would further enhance this rolling and rough terrain following capability over both the helicopter and compound performance envelope. In conclusion, it can be said that nap-of-the-earth flight designed to minimize ground observation is feasible throughout the entire helicopter and compound aircraft speed range, and is further enhanced by the increased speed and maneuvering flexibility of the compound aircraft.